Alright guys, so I believe we left off at biochemistry, in which we were talking about how we could use DNA sequences, how we could use amino acid sequences, and if we have a higher percentage that's similar, that means that we probably have a closer common ancestor. Okay? So we're going to move on to embryology. Embryology is the third piece of evidence that we're going to use to support evolution. Okay, when we're talking about embryology, we're talking about embryos, which is this developing baby and what you'll notice is that the embryos of a lot of different organisms are going to be similar. In fact, it's really hard to tell the difference between a lot of them in the early stages of development. So the early stages of development would be illustrated here, in which we're taking 5 different organisms: a shark, a lizard, a chicken, a pig, and a human. And if you look at them, they all kind of have these similar structures. For example, a tail, okay? And they actually all have gills. You know, the things that fish use to breathe? If you look over here on the picture to the right, we have fish, reptile, bird, and human. And between all 4 organisms, we're going to see gills and tails, okay? Now, the only organism that's fully developed and has gills would actually be fish. Reptiles don't have gills, birds don't have gills, and humans certainly don't have gills, at least not when we're adults. But when we're embryos, we actually have all of those traits. Now, if we look in the middle stage development, we see here that there's going to be a little bit more differentiation, okay? And we lose our tail as humans, and we start to develop these hind limbs, as do pigs, all right? And then if we look at the final stage, we see here that we do get quite significant differentiation. If you look at the lizard and the chicken, there's a little bit more similarity. And if you look at the pig and the human, there's also a little bit of similarity. So let's go to our notes real quick and let's fill those out. So this is going to be on page 2 of your Evidence of Evolution notes. On the bottom right corner, it's going to say page 118. So we see here embryology. Remember, this is the information that's gathered during the early development of different species, can also be used as an evidence for evolution. What is a developing baby? Well, that's going to be the embryo. So let's go ahead and write down embryo here. So embryo. Let me make this a little bit bigger, that way you guys could write it. Okay. So the embryo is a developing baby, and many organisms that are related or have a common ancestor have similar embryonic developments. So let's go ahead and jot those words down as well. So if you have a common ancestor, you're going to have similar embryonic developments. Okay. So that's a little bit about embryology, all right? If we move on to biogeography, biogeography is going to be the study of how organisms are going to be distributed or spread across the world. So if I had a bunch of papers and I asked you to distribute this to the classroom, you would pass them out to each of the students, right? Or if I had a bunch of candy and I asked you to spread it out through the classroom, you would spread them out to each of those kids and not hoard them yourself, right? So when we're talking about biogeography, this is going to be the study of how organisms are distributed or spread across the world. So through the study of biogeography, scientists can observe the effects of different habitats on organisms who are separated geographically. So if you're isolated geographically and you have a different environment, you might have some sort of speciation. So let's go back to our slideshow real quick. So we're here on embryology, but if we move forward, okay, you guys might recognize this. This is the map of the world, right? As we know it. We see here the United States, And if we were to zoom in right about here, we would find Houston. And a lot of you guys are from, you or your parents are from different parts of the world, right? For example, I'm from the Philippines. I was born there, but I grew up here in Texas, okay? Now I'm going to show you another picture that you might not be as familiar with. And this is the picture of the world about 225 to 250 million years ago. If we look at the United States, we're right next to Venezuela. If we look at Brazil, that's going to be right next to Nigeria. Okay? The world has changed a lot in these past 225 million years. This is called the supercontinent of Pangaea. And during a good chunk of the time of the dinosaurs, all right, all the continents on Earth were kind of connected together, okay? And slowly they started to drift apart through something called plate tectonics, something you might remember from middle school, okay? And because of that, you're going to find maybe an organism that was right here on the border of Brazil and Nigeria. But as those two continents started to separate, those descendants of that common ancestor started to differentiate as well. And then we had something called speciation occurring, which is just the creation of species. So if we look at some sort of anteater from long, long, long ago, we find that the descendants of this anteater has kind of differentiated, has become different species in different geographic locations. For example, the giant armadillo in North America, or the spiny anteater in Oceania. Okay, you see how these traits are different from one another? There's that variability that evolution can act on, that natural selection can act on. And depending on what trait is best suited for the environment, which are the best adaptations to have, you can have speciation occurring. A very classic example would be the Galapagos Islands. Now, the Galapagos Islands it's an archipelago, a group of islands that Darwin landed on a couple hundred years ago. So if we look at the Galapagos Islands, it's actually right about here, a little bit north of the equator, or actually right on the equator, and it's just west of Ecuador, okay? And on the Galapagos Islands, one of the classic examples that we get are turtles or tortoises, and also these birds called finches. Now these finches, okay, if you notice, they all have different beaks. Now these beaks are adapted to the food source that's on each island. So the theory is that several million years ago, a flock of birds were kind of scattered to the Galapagos Islands, perhaps due to a storm. And each bird that landed on these different islands started to be selected on by nature. And these traits passed down after generation have compounded so that these traits are now very distinct, and we could actually consider these as different species. The last thing that we're going to talk about our evidence of evolution is called cladograms. But before we do that, let's go ahead and get our notes for biogeography. So if we look at biogeography, we see here distributed and spread, and we have that geographic isolation that we were talking about with Darwin's finches. Okay. Now with these cladograms, what we're going to look at is the evolutionary relationships between different organisms. So let's go ahead and jot that down. So we're looking at relationships, particularly the evolutionary relationships. How are we all related together? For some reason, I cannot type relationships. Okay. How are we all related together? Okay. So common ancestors are shown, and these are going to be at the nodes or the fork. It's like kind of like a fork in a road. These are going to be the nodes between two organisms. Nodes spell N-O-D-E-S. Okay. Traits in a cladogram are cumulative, meaning they build on top of one another. That means a certain organism has all the traits of the organisms that came before it. So we have here an example of a cladogram, right? Unfortunately, graphically, it's not that really high in resolution, so let's switch back to our slideshow. And when we look at our cladogram here, we see that there is a common ancestor for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all 7 of these organisms, okay? That common ancestor was all the way down right here at that node, that fork in the road. And some of the descendants of this ancestor did not develop jaws, and instead they became hagfish. And instead, if you did develop your jaws, okay, you became one of these 6 organisms. And the common ancestor for all 6 are going to be right here. Now, some of these descendants of this common ancestor developed lungs, and some of the descendants of this ancestor did not develop lungs. And if so, you became a fish, like a perch, okay? If you did develop lungs, you became one of these 5 organisms right here, and you were the common ancestor right here at this node. Now, some of the descendants developed claws or nails, and other descendants did not. And if you didn't develop your claws or nails, you became an amphibian like a salamander. But if you did develop claws or nails, you went down this evolutionary pathway and you became one of these 4 organisms. Okay? Similarly, you either became a lizard, or you developed feathers and became a pigeon, or you developed fur and mammary glands and you became a mammal. All right? This is called a cladogram. All right? Different clades tell you different relationships between them. So the further back you are, okay, that means the more distantly you're related. Okay, if your common ancestor is all the way down here, that means that you're pretty distantly related. But if your common ancestor is right here, pigeon, mice, and chimps are going to be more closely related than lizards, for example, okay, whose common ancestor is back here. Right. So if there's no questions, or rather, I'll give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions during class on embryology, biogeography, and reading cladograms.